I'm John Buchanan, and in this video we're going to pick up on where we left last week, looking at mix volume considerations. Thank you so much for all of the questions that have been sent in. It's clear that volume is a really complicated topic, and it's also clear that there are no absolutely hard and fast rules in terms of how you might manage volume through your project. Yes, it's absolutely a good idea to make sure that each individual channel of your mix isn't overloading. And even if those channels aren't overloading, it's a really good idea to make sure that the master output isn't overloading either, because we don't want distortion if we can help it. And as we talked about last week, Logic's got this sort of built-in little limiter, which helps us and at the same time doesn't help us. So in other words, we can hear that even though mixes have gone into the red at the master output channel stage, sometimes we're not hearing that distortion, but we do need to look after it. Now, because of a couple of questions, and also because there's more to say on this subject, this is kind of part two. So if you haven't watched the first one, go back to last week and just watch that video first, and do have a look through the questions that were sent in, many of which I've sort of answered, and we're going to carry on answering those through this video as well. Let's just remind ourselves about the project that we're working on. Sounds like this. Okay, so as I said last week, this is effectively a kind of an arrangement of the Solaris live loop session. So if you want to play around with these sounds, you absolutely can. Okay, I'm going to put a loop around the biggest section of this track, which is obviously going to be the loudest bit. Now, the only thing that I've done since the end of last week's video is that I've come back in and I've further trimmed volume automation. I've dropped the levels of each individual fader, and I've come to this track where we've got volume automation. And what I've done is to sort of trim the volume automation, which I showed you how to do last week, at the same time as dropping the faders for the other channels, so that now I've got 2 dB of headroom at the output stage of my mix. Now, let's answer the first question. A few people have said, what's the target volume you should be aiming for at the output stage? And of course, this is the first thing. When I said there aren't any hard and fast rules, it's 100% true. Now, effectively, the short answer to that is, provided your output level is below 0, you're kind of okay. I would definitely say that if your level, let's say, is less than, I don't know, -6, -7, -8 dB, I would look to bring up individual channel volume. Now, the reason for that is because if you want your music to feel like it has the same sense of kind of volume, a sort of framework, I guess, as other music that's out in the world, you need to remember that the vast majority of commercial music has been mastered. Now, that basically means taking the stereo file of your track and processing it in assorted ways, which we're going to look at in a little while, in order to basically manage and regulate its volume. And generally speaking, we like volume and we find it impressive. When we go to gigs, things are loud and we like getting immersed in sound, and we absolutely turn up the volume when we're playing tracks to our friends because we want them to feel the weight of that volume. So effectively, if our mixes are going to be quieter than everybody else's mixes, that doesn't usually feel very good. And so effectively what we're doing is we're looking to make sure that our music feels like it belongs alongside some of that mastered music. Now then, why then does it matter that mixes can't be too quiet at the output stage? Well, inherent in most audio files and in lots of loops, there is a kind of noise floor. Sounds come with some noise. And of course, some plugins really exacerbate that. If you're working with tape-based plugins, or if you're working with vintage tape delays that have got a kind of noise circuit to give you some tape hiss, every time we have to bring levels up because we're looking to either master our tracks or in some way amplify volume, that noise floor gets lifted. And what we don't necessarily want is to end up with super noisy masters. So if what we can do is to make sure that our output volume is a little bit closer to 0 than, let's say, -8, -9, -10 dB, then effectively at the point where we're starting to inflate volumes a little bit at the mastering stage, we're not bringing up the noise floor and maybe making or sort of pointing our listeners to the kind of artifacts that might be in our tracks. So I would say, as a rule of thumb, something around the -3 dB mark is a good target to aim for. I'm a little bit over that, but I'm not into the red. So I'm going to stick with where I am from a volume perspective. Okay, so we're going to leave the kind of output chain for a moment, because there are a couple of other ways in which I could regulate volume. Now, of course, at the moment, I've got Logic's mixer open, and if I was actually working on a large format mixer, at the very top of every single channel, I would have a gain dial. And of course, we've got a gain plugin. So I could go through my mix and insert a gain plugin at the top of every single channel, and I could produce a gain offset to drop the level of each individual channel's volume, and that would certainly help in terms of reducing volume at the output stage. But I need to be careful. Gain is input volume. It's the beginning of what then happens from a volume profile down through that channel. Think about it as the first stage. Now, what I'm going to do for a moment is I'm going to come up to the drums and I'm going to solo them. And you can see that at the moment, this track has got a compressor on it. And I'm just going to open up the compressor and I'm going to pop it over here for a second. And if I press play, what we're going to have a chance to see is the amount of gain reduction which is being applied to this compressor as a result of the settings that it's using. So remember, what compression does is to effectively reduce the volume of the loudest moments, which we can then boost again if we want to with auto gain or with our own makeup gain profile. But effectively what's going to happen here is we're going to see, when I press play, the amount of gain reduction that's being applied to the drums as a result of compression. Okay, so the loudest moments or I should say the most gain reduced moments, are sort of hitting about the sort of -5 dB point. Okay, fine, no problem. But let's suppose what I decide to do is to go with the kind of gain approach to reducing volume. I can come down to the utility folder of plugins, come into gain, and open up the stereo gain plugin. Okay, fine, no problem. I could then produce a gain offset. Let's suppose I wanted to use this to change the sort of sensitivity of that channel and drop the level by 4 dB. Remember, input level by 4 dB. Let's see what the compressor does now. Okay, so now the gain reduction is up to about -3 dB. Well, that's not a surprise. I've changed the volume profile of this channel, and as a result, anything volume or dynamics based within that channel is going to respond. There's less input volume, and therefore there's less volume for the compressor to be working on. But the problem with that is twofold. Firstly, I've turned volume down by 4 dB, but I'm only losing 2 less decibels from the compressor. So when it comes to reinserting this sound into my mix, it's not going to be balanced alongside any of the channels where I add a gain plugin, which aren't using compression. I hope that makes sense. In other words, the compressor isn't evenly simply dropping 4 dB of gain because it's processing the dynamics of the sound. And not only that, the compressor is going to sound different now. It's only working on less volume than it was before. And so effectively, rather than the kind of a smack and punch that we're getting from the original compression setting, we're now getting a slightly more diluted version of that, which really means if I take the gain approach towards the end of my mix, it could be that I upset the balance of my mix by inserting those gain plugins. So is a gain plugin a good idea in terms of regulating volume? 100%. Absolutely. But try and get it in really early in the writing stage. Every time you set up a channel, if you want to work this way and regulate volume this way, make a gain plugin be the first thing that you add after you've set up an instrument track so that it's there to help you regulate volume as you go. So that's one approach you could take, but just be a little bit careful. Now, another thing that you could do to regulate volume, and we'll look at this next, is the idea of setting up a VCA fader for your entire mix. What does that mean? Okay, well, last week we looked at the idea that the master fader is effectively a VCA style fader for the stereo output. In other words, if I drop this level, then effectively I'm bringing down the level of all of my mix at the stereo output stage. And A little bit later, we'll see why that's a really not great idea if what I want to do is to produce a nice, loud, punchy mix, which feels like it exists alongside the other music in the universe. So for now, we're going to leave that alone, and we're also going to leave the stereo output alone at 0. So how might I use a VCA fader to regulate my mix earlier in the process rather than using the master output one? Well, it works like this. I'm going to select all of the tracks that aren't the auxiliary effects. So I'm leaving the reverb and delay alone. And what I'm going to do instead is to literally control click on any of these tracks, having selected them. And now what I'm going to do is to create a new VCA fader. And you can see that automatically what happens is that Logic is going to assign a VCA fader to all of those channels, which is over here called VCA1. And I could call this anything I wanted to, overall music level or music volume. And effectively now, when I decide that what I want to do is to attenuate volume, I can simply move the slider up and down, and you can see that effectively what's happening is that all of those faders are being dropped. And yes, that is also going to include channels that have got volume automation on them. So if you want a catch-all way of being able to regulate channel volume for all of your tracks, but you don't want to touch the master output or stereo output, you can assign a VCA fader like this and simply use it to attenuate volume. And again, yes, that would absolutely allow me to bring volume down to make sure that it was being regulated before the stereo output stage. Okay, now then, let's come back to this idea of what we might do at the stereo output. So I've talked about the idea that this channel allows us to produce big sounding, sort of punchy mixes. I also talked about the idea that last week, I sort of mentioned the idea that you could put a gain plugin at the top of your stereo output channel. Now, we've just talked about gain plugins, so we know now that effectively this is going to be controlling the input volume into the stereo output. So if you're going to do this, do it right up at the top of the channel. What we don't want to do is to create an output channel solution, put together some plugins which are going to regulate volume, and then use a gain plugin at the end to either push those harder or pull them down. We want, as we'll see, the final plugin to be something that's ultimately regulating the overall output level. So if we were within a dB or so of where we wanted to be, and we didn't want to go back and regulate volume on a per channel basis, we could use a gain plugin. I already know I don't need one because my mix is peaking at -2. Okay, so what instead I'm going to do is to set up the final processor, which I'm going to leave a little bit of a gap before, which is going to be Logic's adaptive limiter. Now, what this plugin allows me to do, let's just make it a little bit bigger, is to basically inflate volume. Now, to really understand what this means, we need to understand how our appreciation of volume works. And it turns out that whilst we do respond to sounds that are short and sort of spiky in terms of their volume, sounds like door slams, if you like to take one example, really the way that we associate volume with sort of level, if you like, is by thinking about average volume. So in other words, if a sound is loud for a long time, we hear that as being louder than sounds that are as loud that only last for a very short period of time. The analogy I always use is, let's suppose we were to record that door slam and we were to regulate its volume at, let's say, -2 dB, and we also recorded, I don't know, a drill being used in the middle of the road, and we recorded that sound and we also put it at -2 dB, and we played those two sounds back to back. The drill would sound louder because it's a sustained sound at a particular volume as opposed to a really transitory one. So if we can increase average volume, our mixes sound louder, even though the very loudest moments in them might not actually be any louder. In other words, we're boosting the volume of the sections which aren't already at maximum volume. Now, I'm going to do a whole video about the adaptive limiter in the future, but for now we're going to look at just two dials, which are the gain dial, which allows me to boost that average volume, and what we refer to as the output ceiling. So I can set here a point above which the volume simply cannot get any louder. Now, this is a really crucial point because, of course, this is going to regulate my overall average volume. So I'm turning up my mix by 3.5 dB, and I'm setting an output ceiling of -0.1 dB, a tenth of a dB below 0. Let's have a look and see what happens. Okay, remember, My mix peaked at -2 dB, and I've just boosted the volume by 3.5 dB. Now what that really means is Logic isn't adding 3.5 decibels to the moments which peak at -2. If it did, they'd go into the red. So effectively what it's doing is it's saying, okay, I've got up to 3.5 decibels of gain to play with, and I can add that wherever I get the opportunity to. And if I don't get the opportunity to add that much because the mix is close enough to zero, then of course I'm not going to add any more volume. So in other words, this is what we refer to as a look-ahead limiter. It's looking into the audio, it's having a think about what's coming up, and it's basically doing some clever maths to add the volume that it can afford to add. And it goes without saying that if I push the gain even harder, then of course the average volume is going to be raised even more, and therefore our mix is going to sound even louder. And if you don't believe me, I'll punch it in after 4 bars. But of course you believed me. Nevertheless, there's the proof. Okay, so what we've effectively got is this idea that if we make the adaptive limiter the final processor within our channel strip, then effectively we're going to be adding the volume we can, making our mixes feel big and inflated, and we're looking after volume. Now, at the very beginning of last week's video and at the beginning of this week's video, I've said don't touch the master fader. Here's why. If what I was doing was to regulate volume using the master fader, let's take it down 3 dB. When I press play now on my adaptive limiter, even though I've set the output ceiling at just under 0 dB, it's not going to get that high. Because the master fader comes after the stereo output channel. It's regulating volume after all of this processing. So effectively, the last thing to say is the first thing I said at the beginning of last week, which is try and leave your stereo output at 0 dB and leave your master output fader at 0 dB. Regulate volume in different ways. So in other words, we want to look after channel volume. We've now looked at lots of ways that we could do that. We've looked this week at the idea of a VCA fader to control that. We've looked at using the gain plugin, and we already know about bringing volumes down and using trim automation to make sure that level is being managed in that way. But what we've started to do this week is to look at an output channel solution to regulate the volume of our tracks. And of course, that's going to be really important moving forward. Now, last thing to say, why did I leave some gaps? Well, as we're going to see in a future video, the adaptive limiter may not be the only processor that you need in order to make your mixes, your kind of inflated, almost semi-mastered mixes, if you like, really punch. So in other words, there may be processors that we need to put in before that, like EQ, like stereo compression, to name 2 examples, stereo widening potentially, but we're always going to want the adaptive limiter to be last. So the reason why I've left a gap is because I don't want to be adding any plugins after that, ever. Think, if I decided to use a gain plugin to push volume now, it's going to peak. We want the adaptive limiter to be the plugin which is regulating ultimate output volume. Okay, so we've geeked out a little bit this week, but hopefully that answers some of the questions that came in on last week's video and pushes the knowledge on just a little bit further.